My son texted me, "Dad, don't come. My in-laws don't want you here." I was standing in front of my full-length mirror. I was already wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my boy's first car. I was adjusting a silk tie with hands that, even after 50 years of taming concrete and steel, were still rough and calloused. Behind me on the bed rested a velvet box. Inside was a cashier's check for $500,000. It was a gift for the party, a party that I had secretly paid $150,000 out of my own pocket to organize. I didn't cry. I didn't call him back to beg for an invitation to my own son's wedding rehearsal dinner. I just looked at my reflection. The reflection of a 70-year-old man who had built half the skyline of this city. And I made a single phone call that lasted 30 seconds. That call left everyone absolutely stunned. And it taught my son that you never ever bite the hand that feeds you. Before I tell you exactly what I said on that call and how the night ended in steel handcuffs and bitter tears, please hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what corner of the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. For this old builder, it means the world to know my story isn't just fading into the wind. I sat down at my desk. The solid mahogany felt heavy and cold under my forearms. This desk was the first truly expensive thing I ever bought for myself 30 years ago, a silent trophy from when Vance Construction landed the contract to build the municipal stadium. The room was quiet, smelling of old paper and lemon wax. I uncapped my fountain pen. The weight of the gold barrel felt familiar and comforting between my fingers. I looked down at the check in front of me. $500. 0, 0, 0. The ink was still fresh on the date line. October 14th. It was a lot of money. For most people, it was a life-changing amount. For me, Thomas Vance, it was simply the dividends of a single quarter in a good year. But my son Brad didn't know that. Brad thought this money represented my life's savings. He thought his old man was scraping the bottom of his retirement fund just to help him and his new bride start their life together. I blew on the ink softly. This check was supposed to be the star surprise of tonight's rehearsal dinner. The dinner at the Oakwood Club, the most exclusive country club in the entire state. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked at the framed photograph on the corner of the desk. It was Brad at 7 years old, holding a plastic hammer, wearing a hard hat that was 3 sizes too big. He looked so happy back then, so eager to build things just like his dad. I sighed, a heavy sound in the empty room. Somewhere along the way, that enthusiasm had turned into a desperate need to please others. Specifically to please Sophia Harrington and her parents, Richard and Cynthia. Brad had come to see me 2 weeks ago, sweating through his dress shirt to ask for a loan. He called it an investment opportunity. He used fancy buzzwords he'd learned in business school, talking about leverage and equity. But I saw right through him. I saw the panic in his eyes. I knew he was trying to cover the exorbitant down payment on a house in the hills, a house the Harringtons insisted was the only suitable place for their daughter to live. I had told him I'd think about it. This check was my answer. I was going to give it to him tonight, not as a loan, but as a gift. A clean slate. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. I remembered the day I officially stepped down as the public face of the company 5 years ago. I handed Brad the title of Chief Operating Officer. I let him move into the corner office with the glass walls. I let him believe he was running the show. It was my way of letting him feel like a man, like a leader. But what Brad never bothered to check, and what he certainly never told his fiancée, was that I kept 51% of the voting shares. I was retired on paper. But in reality, I was still the chairman of the board. I still approved every major acquisition. I still owned the buildings, the machinery, and the land. To Brad, and especially to the Harringtons, I was just a retired contractor living on a pension, driving a 10-year-old Ford truck because I refused to buy a new one. They mistook my frugality for poverty. They mistook my silence for ignorance. I walked back to the desk to put the check inside a silver gift box. That's when my phone buzzed against the wood. The screen lit up with a notification, a text message from Brad. I smiled on instinct. He was probably asking if I was on my way, or maybe asking me to bring that old bottle of whiskey we used to share on big occasions. I picked up the phone, my reading glasses slipping down my nose. The smile died on my lips instantly. "Dad, don't come. My in-laws don't want you here." I stared at the words. I read them again, thinking I must have misunderstood. Maybe it was a typo. Maybe it was a joke. But the next message arrived 3 seconds later. A second blow. They invited Senator Montgomery and some very important investors. They think your style is too blue-collar for the vibe they're trying to create. They're afraid you'll embarrass them. Please understand, Dad. I'll send you pictures later. Love you. My hand didn't shake. I didn't throw the phone. A strange, cold calmness washed over me completely. The same calmness I used to feel when a project was derailing and I had to step in to fix it. Too blue-collar. I embarrassed them. I looked down at my hands. Yes, they were covered in calluses. There was a scar on my left thumb from a table saw accident in 1982. My knuckles were swollen from years of gripping trowels and hammers, but these hands had poured the foundation of the very club where they were dining tonight. These hands had signed the checks that paid for the wine they were drinking right now, the Harringtons. Richard Harrington was a stockbroker who hadn't made a successful trade since the mid-90s. He lived on credit and past glory, driving a rented Bentley, wearing suits he couldn't even afford to dry clean. And Cynthia, a woman who treated waiters like they were furniture. They thought I was the embarrassment, and my son, my own flesh and blood, had agreed with them. He had typed those words. He had chosen their empty prestige over the dignity of his own father. He was willing to banish me from a party that I paid for, just to keep his father-in-law happy. I set the phone down gently on the desk. I could feel the anger boiling deep in my gut. But it wasn't the hot, explosive rage of a young man. It was the cold, hard determination of an old wolf who just got bitten by a pup. I picked up the check. $500. 000. I looked at Brad's name written in my careful block lettering. I thought about the house he wanted to buy. I thought about the way he looked at Sophia, like a dog begging for table scraps. I didn't tear up the check. Not yet. That would be too easy. That would be emotional. And tonight wasn't about emotions. Tonight was about business. I dialed Brad's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it went to voicemail. He was ignoring me. He was probably sitting at the head table laughing at something Richard said, checking his phone under the napkin and hitting ignore. He thought I would just stay home. He thought I would sit here in my recliner, watch the news, and wait for him to send me a couple of pictures cutting the cake. He thought I was a weak man. I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket. It was a tailored suit made by the same tailor who dressed the governor. But I doubted the Harringtons could recognize quality unless it was plastered with a designer logo. I grabbed the silver box with the check inside. I grabbed my car keys, but not the ones for the Ford truck. I reached into the back of the drawer and pulled out the keys to the classic Mercedes convertible. The one I kept under a tarp in the garage, the one I hadn't driven in 2 years. If they cared so much about appearances, I was going to give them an appearance they would never forget. I walked out of my study, turning off the lights. The house was quiet, but my mind was a roar of calculations. I wasn't going there to cause a scene. I wasn't going to yell or curse. I was going there to clear up a few misunderstandings about ownership, net worth, and exactly who was paying for the steak they were about to eat. They didn't want the construction worker perfect. Tonight they were going to meet the chairman of the board. I walked into the garage, pulled the cover off the car, and started the engine. The roar of the machine echoed against the concrete walls. I backed out the tires, crunching on the gravel. I took the main avenue heading toward the hills toward the Oakwood Club. As I drove, I thought about the text message one last time. Dad, don't come. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Oh, I was definitely coming, Brad, and I was bringing a reality check that was going to bounce harder than Richard Harrington's credit score. I pulled up to the security booth at the club. The guard, a kid named Ethan who I had personally hired 3 years ago, stepped out of the booth. He looked at the car, then looked at me, and his eyes widened. "Mr. Vance," he said, standing up straight immediately. "I didn't see your name on the guest list for the Harrington party. They gave me very strict instructions. I rolled down the window and looked him in the eye. "Ethan, who signs your paycheck?" "You do, Mr. Vance," he replied instantly. "Open the gate, Ethan, and call Mr. Carter. Tell him I'm coming in through the back. I want access to the security room." Ethan didn't hesitate. He pressed the button. The wrought iron gate swung wide open. I drove up the winding path lined with the oak trees I had planted myself 20 years ago. The clubhouse loomed ahead, lit up like a palace. I could see the guests mingling on the terrace. I could hear the jazz band playing. Everything looked perfect. It looked expensive. I parked the car in the owner's spot, right next to Richard's rented Bentley. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a moment. I looked at the gift box on the passenger seat. This was the moment of truth. Tonight I wasn't just a father, it was Judgment Day. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. I adjusted my shirt cuffs, grabbed the box and walked toward the service entrance. They wanted me to be invisible. They wanted me to be absent. They were about to get their wish. But first, they were going to learn exactly how much it cost to disrespect Thomas Vance. I pushed open the heavy steel door and walked into the kitchen. The staff stopped dead in their tracks, looking at me with a mix of recognition and fear. "Where is Carter?" I asked quietly. The head chef pointed toward the office. I walked past the sizzling pans and the trays of appetizers that I had paid for. I walked straight into the heart of the operation. It was time to pull the plug on their machine. Note: the narrative reflects on his arrival with his truck times. I parked my 2014 Ford Phone 150 inches front of the main entrance of the Oakwood Club. The engine purred with a sound that was more agricultural than refined, a brutal contrast to the whisper of the limousines and luxury sedans gliding in front of me. I loved this truck. It had dust on the dashboard and blueprints in the back seat. It smelled like sawdust and hard work. But tonight, apparently, it smelled like embarrassment. A private security guard I didn't recognize stepped out of the booth. He wasn't one of my regular employees. He wore a uniform that looked too new with gold epaulets that looked ridiculous. Richard Harrington must have hired an outside firm to make sure the riffraff stayed out. The guard looked at my truck, then looked at me through the windshield. He raised a gloved hand with a sneer of disdain, telling me everything I needed to know about my status in his eyes. I rolled down the window. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and the exhaust of a Porsche waiting behind me. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, though his tone suggested he wanted me to turn around and get out. "Deliveries are in the back. The kitchen entrance is the third left." "I'm not a delivery guy," I said, keeping my voice calm. "My name is Thomas Vance. I'm here for the rehearsal dinner." The guard grabbed a clipboard and exaggerated the motion of running his finger down a laminated list. He took his time, letting the driver of the Porsche behind me honk impatiently. Vance, he muttered. "Sorry, sir. I don't see any Thomas Vance on the VIP list for the Harrington party. Maybe you have the wrong place." I gripped the steering wheel. My knuckles turned white. It wasn't a mistake. It was a blockade. Richard had actually done it. He had erased me from the door list of a building that I built with my own sweat. I picked up my phone from the center console. I dialed Brad again. This time he answered on the first ring, but his voice was a muffled whisper, like he was hiding in a bathroom stall. "Dad, I told you. Brad, please tell me you're not at the front door. I'm looking at a rent-a-cop telling me my name isn't on the list." "Brad, I paid $150. 000 for this dinner. I wrote the deposit check for this venue, and now I'm being turned away like a beggar. Explain this to me, son. Look me in the eye, even over the phone, and tell me why." There was a silence on the line, heavy and suffocating. Then Brad spoke, and his voice trembled with a mix of fear and shame that turned my stomach. "It's not me, Dad. It's Sophia and her parents. They invited Senator Montgomery. They have the CEO of Nexus Corp in there, they said. They said your image doesn't fit." "My image," I repeated, looking at my reflection in the rear-view mirror. "Yeah," Brad continued, his words stumbling over each other faster and faster. "They said you look too blue-collar," Richard said. "He said your hands are rough and calloused and that you look like a bricklayer." He said having a retired construction worker at the head table would confuse the investors. They want to project an image of old money, of blue blood. Dad, they think you're going to ruin the aesthetic. I listened to my son's voice, feeling an ice-cold numbness spread through my chest. It wasn't just Richard. Brad was relaying these insults without defending me. He was accepting their premise that honest work was something to be hidden. So I asked quietly, "And you agreed with them? You agreed that your father, the man who paid for your college, the man who bought your first car, is too dirty to sit with your new family?" "Dad, it's just for one night," Brad pleaded. "Just go home. We'll have a private dinner next week. Just you and me. Somewhere casual where you feel comfortable. Please, Dad, don't cause a scene. The cars are backing up behind you." I looked up at the clubhouse standing against the night sky. The oak trees. It looked magnificent. The limestone pillars were illuminated by soft amber spotlights. The slate roof gleamed. It was a fortress of wealth and exclusion. But I saw something else. I saw the swamp that used to be here 20 years ago. I remembered the smell of stagnant water and mosquitoes. Everyone told me I was crazy to buy this land. They said it was a sinkhole. They said nothing could be built here. I remembered standing knee-deep in mud, holding topographic maps, arguing with city engineers about the drainage. I remembered the 8-hour shifts, operating the excavators myself, because we were behind schedule and over budget. I remembered the day we poured the foundation. Thousands of tons of concrete that had to be absolutely perfect. I knew every steel beam in that structure. I knew where the electrical conduits ran inside the walls. I knew that the third pillar to the left of the porch had a 1,999 penny buried in the mix for good luck. I built this place. I didn't just buy it, I created it. And now my son was telling me I wasn't good enough to walk through the doors I hung with my own hands. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh out loud. They were worried about my calloused hands. They didn't realize those hands held the deed to the ground they were standing on. "All right, Brad," I said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "I understand. You've made your choice. You want to play the aristocrat. You don't want the bricklayer around." "Thanks, Dad." Brad exhaled, sounding relieved. "Thanks for understanding. I knew you wouldn't want to be uncomfortable anyway. I'll call you tomorrow." He hung up. The line went dead. The guard tapped on my window with his flashlight. "Sir, you're blocking the entrance. You need to turn around. There's a service road to the left that will take you back to the avenue." I looked at the guard. I looked at the line of luxury cars behind me. I looked at the clubhouse one last time. I put the truck in reverse, then in drive. I turned the steering wheel, but I didn't head for the avenue. I drove slowly around the perimeter of the parking lot away from the valet parking toward the darkness at the back of the building. "Where are you going?" the guard yelled, stepping out of his booth. "You can't go that way, that's for staff only." I ignored him. I knew exactly where I was going. I knew that around the back corner, hidden behind a row of perfectly manicured hedges, was the loading dock and the staff entrance, and I knew that entrance had a biometric lock that I installed myself. I parked the truck in the shadows near the dumpsters. I turned off the engine. I sat there in the dark for a moment, listening to the distant sound of the jazz band playing inside. They were celebrating. They were toasting to their future. A future funded with my money built on my back. While I sat next to the trash, I pulled out my phone again. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. Carter. Carter had started as a busboy when the club first opened. I had seen his work ethic. I had promoted him. I had paid for his mother's surgery when she got sick 5 years ago. Now he was the general manager, the man pulling the strings, but he never forgot who signed the checks. I pressed the call button. Mr. Vance Carter answered on the second ring, his voice professional but warm. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. Is everything okay with the wire transfer?" "The payment is fine, Carter," I said. "I am currently sitting in my truck at the loading dock." At the loading dock, Carter repeated confusion in his voice. "Sir, why aren't you at the front door? We have the head table set up for you." "My son and his father-in-law don't think I have enough class for the front door, Carter. They have security turning me away at the entrance. They think I'm a liability." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Carter's voice dropped an octave, turning cold and serious. "Mr. Harrington ordered this." "Yes," I said, "and my son played right along," Mr. Vance Carter said. "I will come out there right now personally. I will escort you through the front door and throw anyone who disrespects you out on the street. Just say the word." "No, Carter," I said. "Not yet. No, I don't want to make a scene at the door. I want to see exactly what I paid for. I want to see what they're saying when they think I'm not around. I want you to open the service entrance for me, and then I want you to take me to the security room." "To the surveillance room?" Carter asked. "Yes. I want to watch the party on the monitors. I want to hear the audio. I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with before I step foot in that ballroom. Can you do that for me?" "Consider it done," Mr. Vance Carter said, walking to the back door right now. I hung up the phone and stepped out of the truck. The night air was freezing. I adjusted my jacket. I smoothed my tie. They wanted to hide me in the dark. They wanted to treat me like the help. Perfect. I would enter like the help, but I would leave like the owner. And before this night was over, every person in that ballroom would know exactly who built the floor they were dancing on. I walked toward the steel door, waiting for the click of the lock, ready to start the demolition. Carter opened the steel door before I even had the chance to knock. He stood there, clad in his impeccable black suit, the kitchen lights reflecting off his polished shoes. He didn't look at me with pity or confusion. He looked at me with the absolute reverence of a soldier saluting his general. "Good evening, Mr. Vance," Carter said, stepping aside to let me pass. He made a gesture to the kitchen staff, a silent order that made them avert their eyes, focusing intensely on chopping and sautéing. They knew the protocol. The owner was in the building, and he was in stealth mode. I walked past the stainless steel counters, smelling the rosemary and garlic from the prime rib I had taste tested for the menu 3 weeks ago. It was strange being in the back, moving through the steam and the noise while my credit card was being charged for the party up front. Carter guided me through the maze of hallways past the wine cellar to a discreet door with a simple sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." He punched in a code, scanned his thumbprint, and held the door. I walked into the security control room. It was cool, dark, and humming with the silent power of high-end electronics. This room was the brain of the Oakwood Club. When I built this place, I insisted on a surveillance system that would rival a casino. I wanted to see every corner of my investment. "Have a seat right here, sir," Carter said, pulling out the main ergonomic chair in front of the wall of monitors. I sat down, the leather yielding under my weight. In front of me, a dozen high-definition screens flickered with live feeds from every angle of the club. The parking lot, the lobby, the hallways, and the grand ballroom. "Pull up the head table," I said, leaning forward, "and give me the audio feed." Carter's fingers flew across the keyboard. The center monitor, a massive 6.0-inch 4K screen, came to life. The image was crystal clear. It was like I was hovering right above the centerpiece of white lilies and orchids. There they were, the Harrington clan. Richard was sitting at the head of the table, his face flushed from the expensive Cabernet I had selected. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked a size too small, straining at the buttons. Next to him was Cynthia, dripping in jewelry that I suspected was fake or rented. And there was my son Brad, looking small and terrified, clinging to a water glass like a life preserver. Next to him was Sophia, glowing with a triumph that made my skin crawl. I watched as Richard stood up, tapping a spoon against his crystal glass. The room fell silent. I signaled Carter to turn up the volume. Richard's voice filled the small security room, crisp and clear, as if he were standing right next to me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, puffing out his chest, "I want to welcome you all to Oakwood. As many of you know, the Harrington family has been coming here since the doors opened. It's practically our second home." When Sophia told me she wanted to get married, I said, "Sweetheart, spare no expense. Your father's got this. We rented out the entire facility tonight because my little girl deserves nothing but the best." I felt a vein throb in my temple. Spare no expense. My expense. He was claiming credit for every dollar I had spent. He was standing on my floor under my chandelier, eating my food and telling a room full of senators and CEOs that he was the benefactor. Carter cleared his throat softly, walked over to a filing cabinet in the corner, opened it and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it carefully on the desk in front of me. "I think you should see this, Mr. Vance Carter said quietly. Since you're auditing operations tonight." I opened the folder. It was a financial profile on Richard Harrington. As the owner of the club, I had the right to review any member's account. What I saw made me let out a low, humorless whistle. Richard Harrington wasn't just broke. He was drowning. He was going under. The top document was a delinquency notice. Richard hadn't paid his membership dues in 3 years. 36 months. The only reason his membership hadn't been revoked was because Brad had quietly paid the last 2 installments from his own account. I turned the page. A credit bureau check performed by the club's finance department when Richard tried to book the ballroom 3 months ago. Declined. Insufficient funds. 7 active liens on his primary residence. A credit score lower than the temperature outside. This wasn't old money. This wasn't a blue blood lineage. It was a house of cards held together with hairspray and delusions of grandeur. They weren't aristocrats. They were grifters wearing Gucci belts. I looked up at the screen. Richard was sitting down now, basking in the applause of guests who believed he was a titan of industry. He leaned over to whisper something to the senator sitting next to him, probably a lie about his investment portfolio. "Can you isolate the audio on the bride and her mother?" I asked Carter. Carter nodded and adjusted the parabolic microphone settings on the touchscreen. The ambient noise of the party faded away, replaced by the sharp, stealthy whispers of the 2 women sitting to Brad's left. Sophia was leaning close to her mother, Cynthia. They were clinking their wine glasses. "Did you see the text?" Sophia asked, a mocking smile playing on her lips. "Brad said the old man isn't coming. He actually bought the excuse about the VIP guests." "Thank God," Cynthia sighed, taking a long sip of wine. "I was terrified he was going to show up in a flannel shirt and work boots. It's hard enough convincing the senator to invest in Richard's new venture without having a bricklayer sitting across from him." "He's not just a bricklayer," Mom Sophia laughed. "He's our golden goose. Brad says he's bringing a check tonight. $500,000. I stared at the screen. My hand went instinctively to the breast pocket of my jacket where the torn pieces of that check should have been. But instead I felt the sharp edge of the folded invoice I had printed earlier. 500,000, Cynthia whispered, her eyes wide with greed. That's enough to cover the interest on the bridge loan and keep the bank from foreclosing on the house for another 6 months. We just need to get that check into the account first thing Monday morning. It gets better, Sophia said, lowering her voice even more. I leaned closer to the speaker, my breath catching in my throat. Brad signed the prenup exactly the way my dad drafted it, Sophia said. He didn't even let a lawyer look at it. He thinks it's just standard procedure. Once we have the money and the wedding is official, his assets merge with ours. We can use his credit line to refinance the debt. And what about the old man? Cynthia asked. Sooner or later he's going to be a problem. He controls the son too much. Don't worry about him, Sophia said, her voice turning ice-cold and cruel. Once we secure the funds and sign the marriage certificate, I'm going to put Brad to work on him. We'll say he's going senile. You know, forgetting things, acting erratic. Brad is so docile he'll believe it if I repeat it enough times. We can probably get power of attorney in less than a year. Then we stick him in that clinic upstate, the one with the high walls. That way, he won't be bothering us at the golf club. The room seemed to tilt. The air in the security booth suddenly felt thin. Dump me in a nursing home. Declare me incompetent. Take away my life's work, my dignity, and lock me away so they could spend my money on their charade. And Brad, my son. They saw him as nothing more than a tool, an easy mark, a means to an end. They were going to bleed him dry and then use him to bury me. I looked at Brad on the screen. He was looking at Sophia with pure adoration, completely unaware that the woman he was about to marry was plotting to dismantle his father's life. He was a sheep sitting at a table of wolves, and he had just invited them to dinner. I leaned back in the chair. The shock faded, replaced by a hard glacial clarity. This was no longer just disrespect. This was no longer just a snub. This was war. They weren't just trying to exclude me, they were trying to erase me. I closed the folder on the desk. I looked at Carter. His face was pale. He had heard every word. He looked at me, waiting for an order, waiting for an explosion. But I didn't explode. Builders don't explode. We deconstruct. We take things apart brick by brick, beam by beam, until the structure collapses. Carter, I said, my voice firm and gravelly. You have master control of the ballroom's audiovisual system. Yes, sir, Carter said. I can control everything from here. The screens, the microphones, the lights. Good, I said. And we still have that policy regarding members who are over 90 days late on their dues. Yes, sir, Carter replied, a grim little smile appearing on his lips. Immediate suspension of privileges and a ban from the premises until the debt is settled in full. Excellent, I said. Print out Mr. Harrington's complete statement. Every unpaid martini, every bounced check, every month of back dues. And Carter, yes, Mr. Vance. Cut the music. It's time to make a toast. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I checked my reflection in the dark monitor one last time. The old man in the flannel shirt wasn't coming to dinner. The owner was on his way, and he was bringing the eviction notice. I turned and walked out of the security room, heading for the service hallway that led directly to the stage entrance of the ballroom. The wolves were eating, and I was about to flip their table. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob of the security room. I was ready to walk out and end this farce, but Carter called out to me. His voice was urgent, shaking me out of my momentum. Mr. Vance, he said, you need to see this. I paused and turned around. Carter was pointing at the main monitor. On the screen, the camera had automatically zoomed in on my son, Brad. He was no longer looking down at the table. He no longer looked terrified. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine with a look of arrogant confidence on his face that I didn't recognize. It was a look that didn't belong to the boy I raised. It belonged to a stranger. I walked back to the console and leaned in, my eyes locked on the screen. Richard Harrington was laughing, slapping Brad on the back. You know Brad, Richard, said, his voice dripping with that fake camaraderie I despised so much. Once we have this check, we're safe for a few months. But we need a long-term solution. Your father's assets are substantial, but if he's as stubborn as you say, accessing the real capital might be difficult while he's still lucid. I watched Brad. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to say that I was sharp as a tack, that I could still run circles around men half my age, that I was the one who taught him everything he knew. I waited for my son to be a man. Instead, Brad let out a chuckle. It was a dry, dismissive sound. Don't worry about the old man, Richard, Brad said. He waved his hand in the air dismissively. Dad's losing it. He's practically senile lately. Half the time I don't even think he knows what day of the week it is. He just sits in that house watching old westerns. The breath caught in my throat. Senile, losing it. I ran a multi-million-dollar corporation from my home office. I tracked market trends every day. I knew the price of steel in Shanghai before Brad had even had his morning coffee. But to him, my silence was senility. My trust was weakness. Brad leaned closer to the center of the table, lowering his voice, but the high-tech microphones picked up every syllable with devastating clarity. He trusts me blindly. Brad continued, a twisted smile on his lips. He signs anything I put in front of him. He doesn't even read the documents anymore. He just looks at me with those tired eyes and signs on the dotted line. Sophia giggled, stroking Brad's arm. That's so smart, baby. It's better than smart, Brad said. It's already done. I already have the papers prepared for the transfer of the house, the property deeds. I slipped them in with a bunch of insurance renewals last week. He thinks he was signing flood coverage. Once I file those papers on Monday morning, the house will be in my name. We can tap into the property equity immediately. That's another $3 million. Easy. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. The room spun for a second. I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. He wasn't just letting them insult me. He wasn't just borrowing money to impress them. He was stealing my home. He was stealing the house where he grew up. The house where his mother died. The house I built with my own hands for our family. He had looked me in the face, handed me a stack of papers and lied to me, banking on the idea that I was too old and stupid to figure it out. I remembered that day last week. He had come over for coffee. He seemed helpful, organized. Dad, just some paperwork for the property insurance, he had said. I signed it because I trusted him. Because fathers are supposed to trust their sons. I had raised a viper in my chest. I had raised a boy, given him every opportunity, handed him a career, and in return he was plotting to leave me on the street just to fund his father-in-law's gambling debts. The sadness I had felt earlier evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, searing white-hot clarity. The father inside me died at that moment right there in the security room. The man who was left was the CEO, the builder. The man who knows that when a foundation is rotten, you don't patch it up. You demolish it. I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now. Deadly steady. I swiped past Brad's name, past the family contacts. I stopped on a name that struck terror into the hearts of contractors and city inspectors alike. Ben Sterling, my personal attorney. The man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he dug the holes himself. I pressed call. It was 8:00 p.m. on a Friday, but Ben answered on the second ring. He knew that if I called at this hour, either the building was on fire or I was buying a new one. Thomas Ben said, his voice a little raspy. "Everything okay?" "No, Ben," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, void of warmth, stripped of mercy. "Nothing is okay, but it's about to be corrected." "What do you need, Thomas?" "I need you to open your computer, Ben. Right now." I could hear the rustle of movement on the other end, the sound of a chair scraping the click of keys. Opening it up. "What am I looking for?" "I want you to pull the internal ledgers for the Vance Logistics division." Brad's division. There was a pause. The silence stretched across the line. "Thomas, that is highly irregular. Brad is the director. Is there an issue with the quarterly report?" "I don't care about the report, Ben," I said, locking my eyes on the screen where my son was now toasting with his father-in-law celebrating his theft. "I want you to check the escrow accounts. I want you to check the capital reserves. And I want you to cross-reference every withdrawal over 50 grand from the last 6 months with any shell companies associated with Richard Harrington." Thomas Ben said slowly, his voice dropping. "You're asking me to audit your son for embezzlement. I'm asking you to find the money he stole, Ben," I snapped. "He just admitted on video that he committed fraud. He admitted to tricking me into signing the deed transfer for my personal residence. If he's willing to steal my house, he's already gutted the company." "I know. I'm sorry." I heard the rapid clacking of keys. Ben was moving fast. He smelled blood in the water now. "Give me 2 minutes," Ben said. "I'm logging into the master admin account." I waited. On the screen, the party continued. The waiters were clearing the appetizer plates. Brad was laughing with his head thrown back, looking like the king of the world. He had no idea the guillotine blade was already falling. Ben's voice came back tight and sharp. "I'm looking at the logistics center operations account. There's a discrepancy." "How much?" I asked. "There was a wire transfer 3 days ago for $2 million. It was labeled as equipment acquisition for a new distribution center in Dallas." "We don't have a distribution center in Dallas," I said coldly. "Exactly," Ben said. "The funds were transferred to a holding company called Harrington Investments, LLC. Richard Harrington," I said. It wasn't a question. "Looks like it," Ben confirmed. "Thomas, this is a felony. This is grand larceny corporate espionage. If we report this—" "Yes," I interrupted. "There is no if, Ben. I want you to freeze it. I can try to put a stop payment order on it, but if it's already cleared, freeze everything else," I ordered. "Lock him out of the system. Revoke his security clearance. Cancel his corporate credit card. I want his keycard to stop working before they serve dessert. And Ben, yes, Thomas, draft the termination papers for cause, gross misconduct, theft, and prepare a civil suit against Richard Harrington for the recovery of stolen corporate assets." Thomas Ben said softly. "He's your son. This is going to send him to prison." I looked at the screen one last time. I looked at the boy who had just bragged about conning his senile father. "I have no son, Ben. I have an employee who just stole $2 million. Do it, and call the police. Tell them to meet me at the Oakwood Club." I hung up the phone. I didn't look at Carter. I didn't need to. I knew he was standing at attention ready for the next order. I stepped away from the monitors. I was done watching. It was time to present myself to the guests. I stood in the security control room for a few moments longer, my eyes fixed on the 60-inch monitor showing the banquet in high definition. The rage from earlier had cooled into something solid and heavy like a block of ice sitting in my stomach. I needed to see this. I needed to witness the full magnitude of their arrogance before I dropped the hammer. On the screen, the waiters were pouring champagne. Not just any champagne, but a vintage Dom Perignon that sold for hundreds of dollars a bottle. I watched as Richard Harrington stood up again, tapping his glass to get everyone's attention. He looked flushed, victorious, a man who believed he had just pulled off the heist of the century. He didn't look like a broke man. He looked like an emperor. Brad was next to him, my son. He didn't look like an emperor, but more like a court jester, smiling nervously, nodding at everything his father-in-law said. He was a puppet, and Richard was pulling the strings with hands that were greasy with my money. Friends, family, distinguished guests. Richard boomed, his voice amplified by the sound system that I had paid for. I want to propose a toast, not just to the happy couple, but to the future, to the new era of the Harrington legacy. He paused for effect, looking around the room, soaking up the adoration of people who had no idea he was spending stolen money. You know, Richard continued, swirling the golden liquid in his glass, in business, as in life, you have to be bold. You have to seize opportunities when they present themselves. And I am thrilled to announce tonight that thanks to the strategic brilliance of my future son-in-law Brad, we are launching a massive new venture. I stepped closer to the screen. The security room was completely silent except for the hum of the cooling fans and Richard's voice. We are expanding into the logistics sector, Richard announced proudly. We have secured a premier distribution facility in Dallas, a state-of-the-art complex that will be the cornerstone of our new empire. This is just the beginning. Welcome to the Harrington Renaissance. The room erupted in applause. I looked at Brad. I waited for him to flinch. I waited for a sign of guilt. That was my warehouse. That was my land. That was the Sector 4 complex that he had mortgaged behind my back. And there he was, letting Richard Harrington claim it as his own. Brad was clapping too. He was applauding his own theft. He was applauding the destruction of his father's company. It was a feast of vultures. They were picking my bones clean while I was still alive and congratulating each other on the banquet. I looked down at the silver gift box in my hands. Inside was the cashier's check for $500, 000. A gift, a blessing, a father's love in paper form. I opened the box. I took out the check. I looked at the numbers, a 5 and 5 zeros. I thought about the hours I had worked to earn that money, the winters spent on freezing scaffolds, the summers sweating in trenches, the missed birthdays, the early mornings. I had saved that money to make sure my son never had to struggle the way I did. And he had taken that sacrifice and thrown it in the mud for a round of applause from a room full of strangers. Slowly, deliberately, I tore the check in half. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. I put the two halves together and tore them again and again, until the $500,000 was nothing more than confetti. I dropped the pieces onto the desk of the security console. It looked like snow. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt lighter. The weight of trying to buy his love, of trying to be good enough for them, was gone. But I couldn't go out there empty-handed. A guest should always bring a gift, and a creditor should always bring a bill. I looked around the desk. I saw a printed dinner menu that Carter had left there earlier. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock with raised gold lettering. Rehearsal dinner at Oakwood. I flipped it over to the blank side. I took my gold fountain pen out of my inside pocket. I uncapped it. I placed the card on the desk and began to write. My hand was steady. My handwriting was bold and jagged, the handwriting of a man who used blueprints, not spreadsheets. I wrote 3 lines. Line 1, reimbursement for unauthorized loan, $2,000,000,000. Line 2, ballroom rental and catering fees, $150,000,000. Line 3, termination of employment contract effective immediately. I signed it at the bottom. Thomas Vance, chairman of the board. I blew on the ink to dry it. It wasn't a check. It was a declaration of war. It was the bill of sale for their souls. I placed the card inside the silver velvet-lined box where the check used to be. It fit perfectly. I looked up at the screen one last time. Richard was sipping his champagne. Sophia was whispering something to her mother, probably calculating how fast they could spend the money they thought they were getting. Brad was shaking hands with the senator, looking like he belonged there. They looked so comfortable, so safe. They thought the walls of Oakwood were protecting them. They didn't realize the walls belonged to me. I stood up. Sum Suntai. Suntum Sun. Tie. I adjusted my cuffs. I checked my tie. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. I didn't see a construction worker. I didn't see a retired old man. I saw a storm. Carter was standing by the door watching me. He had seen me tear up the check. He had seen me write the note. He didn't say a word, but his posture was straighter, his jaw tight. He was ready. Carter, I said, my voice low and devoid of any emotion. Yes, Mr. Vance. Don't let anyone out through the service doors. Lock them. Done, sir. And Carter, yes, sir. Cut the music. It's showtime. Carter nodded and reached for the master audio control. I walked out of the security room and into the service hallway. I could hear the jazz band playing an upbeat, lively number. It sounded like a celebration. As I walked down the hall, the music suddenly distorted. It slowed down and then cut out completely with a sharp electronic hiss. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden. I could hear the confused murmur of the crowd through the walls. I pushed open the double doors that led to the stage. The bright lights of the ballroom hit me, but I didn't blink. I stepped out from the wings, the silver box in my hand, walking toward the center of the stage, like a ghost returning to haunt the living. Richard Harrington was still holding his glass, his mouth open, mid-laugh. He froze when he saw me. The senator lowered his drink. Sophia dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against the china, and Brad, my son. He looked at me, and for a second he looked like that little boy with the hard hat again. But then the fear took over. Pure, unadulterated terror. Because he knew the man walking toward him wasn't the dad who signed school permission slips. It was the man who poured concrete over his problems. I walked to the center of the stage. The main lights were blinding, but I could see them all. Every single one of them. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch until it was painful, until they started squirming in their seats. I looked directly at Richard Harrington. I heard you were toasting to your new empire, Richard, I said, my voice booming without the need for a microphone in the dead silent room. I figured I'd come down here to collect the rent personally. I stood in the center of the stage under the unforgiving glare of the lights, looking at the people who had spent the last 3 hours drinking my wine and laughing at my expense. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It wasn't the respectful silence of an audience waiting for a speech. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a disaster unfolding in real time. A few moments ago, this room had been filled with the warm glow of candlelight and the soft hum of jazz. Now stripped of the ambience, it looked exactly like what it was, a room full of strangers eating food they didn't pay for, hosted by a fraud drowning in debt. I locked eyes with Richard Harrington. He was still standing, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth, the champagne glass tilting dangerously. His face had gone from a flush of victory to a pale, waxy mask of shock. He looked at me like I was a corpse that had crawled out of its grave to crash his party. Next to him, the senator lowered his glass. His political instincts kicking in, sensing that the wind had just violently changed direction. I didn't say a word. I just let them look at me. I let them see the tailored charcoal suit that fit me perfectly. I let them see the silk tie. I let them see the silver gift box in my hand. But mostly I let them see my face. I wasn't the smiling, accommodating father they were used to. I wasn't the quiet old man who sat in the corner at family dinners. I was the man who had negotiated contracts with unions and city councils. I was the man who had fired incompetent foremen without blinking. I was the man who built things to last and destroyed things that were structurally unsound. Sophia was the first to break the silence. She stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor, a screech that made half the room wince. She looked unhinged. Her perfect bridal makeup was contorted by a mix of arrogance and fury. "Get out," she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. "Who let him in? Brad, do something. He's ruining everything." She pointed a flawlessly manicured finger at me, her hand shaking with rage. "This is a private event. You're trespassing. Call security. Get him out of here right now." I looked at Brad, my son. He was sitting next to her, but he looked like he was physically shrinking. He was staring at the white tablecloth, wishing he could dissolve into the fabric. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew the silver box in my hand no longer held a check. He knew his house of cards wasn't just collapsing, it was being incinerated. Brad, Sophia hissed, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. "Why are you just sitting there? Tell him to leave." Brad didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the weight of his own betrayal. Richard Harrington found his voice. Then he puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his dignity in front of the VIPs he was trying to impress. He slammed his glass down on the table, splashing champagne onto the expensive linens. "Security," Richard bellowed, waving his arm frantically toward the back of the room. "Where is security? Remove this man immediately. He's a foolish, senile old man who wandered in off the street. He's disturbing my guests." The murmurs started. The guests were whispering, looking back and forth between the furious father of the bride and the calm, imposing figure on the stage. They were confused. They thought this was some kind of joke or maybe a family feud gone wrong. They didn't understand they were witnessing an execution. "I heard you didn't want me here, Richard," I said. My voice was quiet, but it projected to the back of the room effortlessly. "I heard you thought I didn't have enough class to sit at your table." Richard's face turned a deep, ugly shade of red. "I don't know how you got past the gate, Thomas, but you are leaving right now. You are embarrassing your son. Look at him. You're humiliating him on his wedding weekend." I looked at Brad again. He finally looked up, his eyes wet with tears of terror. "I'm not the one humiliating him, Richard," I said. "I'm the one saving him from a lifetime of being your personal ATM." That was the last straw for Richard. He turned toward the side of the room, where a group of uniformed men had just walked through the double doors. These weren't the rented security guards from the front gate. These were my men, the internal security team of the Oakwood Club. Men I had hired. Men I had trained. Men who knew exactly who signed their paychecks. Officers, Richard yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Arrest that man. He is trespassing on private property. Drag him off this stage and throw him out on the street." The guests gasped. The senator looked ready to crawl under the table. Sophia was now smirking, her arms crossed, waiting to see me handcuffed and humiliated. She wanted to see the old bricklayer tossed out by the trash. The 4 guards marched down the center aisle. Their boots thudded heavily against the floor in perfect synchronization. They didn't look at the guests. They didn't look at Richard. They walked with a purpose that made the air in the room feel thick. Richard smiled. He thought they were coming for me. He thought his order carried weight because he was wearing a tuxedo and standing at the head table. He didn't realize that in this building his voice was nothing but noise. The guards reached the stage. They walked up the stairs, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. Richard's smile widened. "Get him out of here," Richard sneered. But the guards didn't grab me. They didn't touch me. Instead, they walked right past me and turned around to face the crowd. They formed a protective semicircle behind me. Their arms crossed over their chests, their faces stone cold and impassive. They weren't there to remove me. They were there to enforce my will. They were my Praetorian Guard. The smile slid off Richard's face like mud. Sophia's smirk vanished. The room fell into a dead silence once again. I took a step forward. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was pure steel. "But it seems you're confused about how property rights work in this country. You see, you can't evict the owner." "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his voice losing its boom. "I rented this hall. I paid the deposit." "You haven't paid anything," I corrected him. You haven't paid a single bill in this city since 2010. Carter stepped out from the wings. He was holding a wireless microphone. He walked to the center of the stage with a tall, dignified posture. He stopped next to me and handed me the mic, but before stepping back, he turned to address the stunned audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carter announced, his voice echoing through the speakers, crisp and professional, "I apologize for the interruption of your dinner. However, Oakwood protocol requires that when the chairman of the board is present, he must be acknowledged." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I saw the senator's eyes widen. I saw the CEO of Nexus Corp lean forward, sudden recognition washing over his face. "It is my honor." Carter continued to introduce the sole owner of the Oakwood Club, proprietor of these grounds, and founder of Vance Construction, Mr. Thomas Vance. The name hit the room like a physical impact. Vance Construction. In this state, that name meant infrastructure. It meant skyscrapers. It meant power. And for the Harringtons, it meant the end of the world. Sophia looked at me, her mouth hanging open. She looked at Brad. "You said he was a construction worker," she shrieked. "You said he was a nobody." Brad buried his face in his hands. Richard Harrington collapsed into his chair like his strings had been cut. He looked at the walls of the club, the expensive chandeliers, the marble floors. He realized finally that he had been insulting the king inside his own castle. I raised the microphone to my lips. "I heard you were worried about appearances," I told the room. "I heard you didn't want a blue-collar guy ruining your aesthetic. Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is you're right. I am a builder. My hands are dirty." I held up my hand, showing my calluses to the room. "The bad news," I continued, my eyes drilling into Richard, "is that I am the only person in this room who has the power to decide who stays and who goes. And quite frankly, I don't like the company I'm keeping." I stood there with the cold microphone in my hand, watching the revelation wash over the room like a freezing tide. The silence was no longer shock. It was anticipation. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I was holding the whole boot factory. I looked at the senator, a man whose campaign I had quietly donated to for years. I looked at the CEO of Nexus. They were uncomfortable. They knew something smelled rotten, but they didn't know the source. I was about to show them the body. "Richard," I said, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. "You were telling these fine people about your new venture, about the expansion, about the Harrington legacy. It sounded very impressive, very expensive." Richard was trying to shrink into his chair, his face dripping with sweat. He dabbed his forehead with a napkin, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "But, you know," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage. "In my line of work, before we pour the foundation, we do a soil mechanics test. We check if the ground is solid enough to hold the weight. And Richard, I have to tell you, your ground isn't just soft, it's a swamp." I raised my hand and pointed to the massive projection screen behind the head table. It was currently showing a looping slideshow of engagement photos. Brad and Sophia on the beach. Brad and Sophia on a yacht that I knew Richard had rented for an hour just for the photo shoot. It was a montage of a Lee. "Carter," I said into the mic, "let's show the guests the real portfolio." Switch the feed. The screen flickered. The smiling faces of my son and his fiancée disappeared. In their place, a document appeared. It was stark, white, and covered in red stamps. It was blown up to 10 feet tall, impossible to ignore. A collective gasp went through the room. It wasn't a wedding photo. It was a foreclosure notice. "This," I said, pointing at the screen, "is the deed to the Harrington residence, the ancestral home. As you can see by the date stamp in the corner, the process started 6 months ago. Richard hasn't made a mortgage payment since 2021. Richard jumped up, knocking his chair over. "Turn that off," he screamed, his voice cracking. "This is an invasion of privacy. I'm going to sue you." I ignored him. Next slide, Carter. The image changed. This time it was a credit card statement. A very long, very red statement. "American Express," I read aloud. "Past due balance, $85,000. Status, in collections." And look at the charges. The Four Seasons Cartier online casinos. Looks like the Harrington legacy is being funded by high-interest debt and internet gambling. The senator stood up, took his napkin, wiped his mouth, and tossed it on the table. He looked at Richard with a mix of pity and disgust. "Richard," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You told me you were liquid. You told me my investment was backed by real estate." "It is," Richard stammered, reaching a hand out. "Senator, please, this is a misunderstanding. This man is vindictive. He's doctoring the files." "I'm not doctoring anything, Richard," I said. "I'm auditing." Next slide. The screen changed again. This was the one that made the room freeze. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a Las Vegas police report. It detailed an incident involving unpaid casino markers and a subsequent altercation. But attached to it was a promissory note, a document signed by Richard Harrington to a private lending entity that had no website and no credit bureau rating. "You see, folks," I said, addressing the room, "Richard didn't just borrow from banks. Banks have rules. Banks say no. So Richard went to the kind of lenders who don't ask for a credit score. They ask for your kneecaps as collateral. That is a $200,000 loan from what the police politely call an unbanked entity. That's loan shark money, Richard, and it was due last week." Sophia let out a sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, staring at her father in horror. She didn't know this part. She knew they were broke, but she didn't know they were dangerously broke. She didn't know her daddy was gambling with blood money. "That's why you needed my check tonight, wasn't it?" I asked, looking down at him. "You weren't going to invest it. You were going to use my life savings to save your own skin. You were going to launder your dirty laundry with my son's inheritance." The room was in motion now. The VIPs weren't sticking around for dessert. The CEO of Nexus Corp was already halfway to the door, talking furiously on his cell phone, probably killing whatever deal he had made with Richard. The senator was escorting his wife to the exit, not even looking back. The illusion of power and prestige had shattered, leaving only the ugly, desperate reality of a conman caught in the act. Richard looked around the room. He saw his audience leaving. He saw his social status evaporating. He saw the end of his life as he knew it. He panicked. He clutched his chest. He let out a choked gasp. "Oh, God," he moaned. "My heart. I can't breathe." He collapsed onto the floor. It was a very theatrical fall. A little too slow, a little too controlled. He landed on the expensive carpet, clutching his tuxedo shirt, gasping for air. "Daddy!" Sophia screamed, rushing to his side. She fell to her knees. "Somebody help him. Call 911. He's having a heart attack." Cynthia was fanning him with a menu, looking around desperately. "You killed him," she shrieked at me. "You killed my husband." The room hesitated. Even the people who were leaving stopped. A heart attack was serious. A heart attack demanded sympathy. I watched from the stage. I didn't move. I didn't call for a doctor. I just watched Richard writhing on the floor, giving the performance of his life. "Carter," I said calmly into the mic, "don't call an ambulance." The room turned to look at me. I saw shock on their faces. They thought I was a monster. They thought I was letting a man die. I walked down the steps of the stage. I walked slowly, deliberately, until I was standing right over Richard. He was groaning, his eyes squeezed shut. But I noticed his color was normal. He wasn't sweating. His breathing was rhythmic, not erratic. "Get up, Richard," I said. My voice was flat, cold. He moaned louder. "My chest," he whispered in pain. I bent down close to his ear, but I kept the microphone near my mouth so everyone could hear. "I know you're faking, Richard, and I know why. You think an ambulance ride is going to get you out of here without answering any more questions. You think a hospital bed is a sanctuary." I stood back up and addressed the room. His premium health insurance policy was cancelled 45 days ago for non-payment, I announced. I saw the notice in his file. "If you call an ambulance now, Richard, they'll take you to the county hospital. And since you have no coverage and no credit, they'll stabilize you and bill you. And when they figure out you're faking, they'll discharge you directly into the arms of the police officers my lawyer just called." Richard's moaning stopped abruptly. His eyes snapped open. He looked at me, and the hate in his eyes was pure and unmasked. He realized his escape hatch had been welded shut. The performance was over. He stood up awkwardly, dusting off his tuxedo, his face burning with humiliation. The guests who had stayed to watch the drama were now looking at him with absolute contempt. Faking a heart attack was a new low, even for him. "You're a monster, Richard," spit at me. "No, Richard," I said. "I'm just the auditor. And the audit is over. You're bankrupt. You're a fraud. And you're trespassing." I turned my back on him. He wasn't worth another second of my time. He was a ghost, a bad memory. I turned my attention to the person who actually mattered, the person whose betrayal cut deeper than any unpaid bill. I walked over to the table where my son was sitting. Brad hadn't moved. He hadn't gone to help his father-in-law. He hadn't tried to leave. He was frozen in his chair, staring at me like a deer in the headlights, watching an 1-8 Wheeler get closer and closer. He looked small. He looked weak. He looked exactly like the kind of man who would steal from his father because he was too afraid to work for himself. "Hello, Brad," I said softly. He looked up at me, his lip trembling. "Dad," he whispered. "Can I explain?" I shook my head. "There are no explanations, son. We're past the explanation phase. Now we're in the numbers phase. And your numbers don't add up." I reached into the silver box and pulled out the file Ben had sent me. The evidence of the warehouse mortgage, the forgery, the theft. "And you, my precious son," I said, dropping the heavy folder onto the table in front of him with a dull thud that echoed like a gunshot. "You have a lot of accounting to do." The folder hit the table with a finality that seemed to rattle the silverware. It sat there between us, a thick stack of papers held together with a metal clip, looking harmless but containing enough legal dynamite to bring down a skyscraper. Brad stared at it. He didn't want to touch it. He looked like a man who had just been handed a live grenade with the pin pulled. "Open it," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried a density that made disobedience impossible. "Open it, Brad. Read the title of the first document out loud so your new family knows exactly what you brought to the marriage." Brad's hand shook violently as he reached out. He flipped open the cover. His eyes scanned the page, growing wider with every line. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Affidavit of forgery," he whispered. "Louder," I ordered. "Affidavit of forgery," he said, his voice cracking. "Regarding the commercial mortgage of the Sector 4 distribution complex." "That's right," I said, leaning over the table, planting my hands on the white linen. $2 million, Brad. You stole the deed to my most valuable property. You forged my digital signature. You mortgaged the ground I walk on. And for what? To pay your father-in-law's gambling debts. To buy a seat at a table where you were the main course." I looked at Sophia. She was staring at the folder, her mind working in overdrive, calculating the damages. She wasn't looking at Brad with concern. She didn't care about his legal troubles. She cared about the math. "You told me he signed it over to you, Sophia," said her voice dripping with venom. "You told me the transfer was legal. You said we had the capital." I thought I could fix it," Brad stammered, looking between her and me, desperate to find an ally and finding no one. "I was going to pay it back, Dad. I swear. Once the investment paid off." "There was no investment, Brad," I roared, slamming my fist on the table. The sudden violence of the movement made him flinch backward. There was no new venture. There was only a black hole of debt named Richard Harrington. You threw my money into a bonfire, hoping it would keep you warm. You stole from the man who raised you to feed the man who despises you. I reached into the box and pulled out another sheet of paper. It was a printout of the wire transfer. "Look at the beneficiary, Brad. Harrington Investments, LLC, a shell company. You didn't even try to hide it. You were arrogant. You were so sure I was just a senile old bricklayer who wouldn't notice a $2 million hole in his books. Did you think I was stupid?" "No, Dad, never," Brad cried, tears streaming down his face now. I wanted to be somebody. I wanted to be on their level." "You wanted to be on their level," I repeated, pointing at Richard, who was still dusting off his knees, looking sullen and trapped. "Well, congratulations, son. You made it. You're a fraud, you're a liar, and you're broke. You fit right in." Brad slid off his chair. He didn't stand up. He dropped. He fell to his knees on the hardwood floor of the stage right in front of me. He grabbed the hem of my jacket, clinging to the fabric like a castaway clinging to a rope. It was a pathetic sight. My son, the director, the MBA graduate, the future of my company, crawling on the floor in a tuxedo that I paid for. "Dad, please," he sobbed. "I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't do this. Don't ruin me." I looked down at him. I tried to find a spark of pity in my heart. I tried to remember the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after a long day. But all I could see was the man who had laughed while calling me incompetent. All I could see was the signature on the mortgage documents that put the livelihood of my employees at risk. "You ruined yourself, Brad," I said coldly, pulling my jacket out of his grip. "You did this. Every signature, every lie, every stolen dollar. That was you. You built this prison brick by brick, and now you have to live in it." Sophia stood up slowly. She looked down at Brad, who was weeping at my feet. The look on her face wasn't heartbreak. It was a look of pure disgust and revulsion. It was the look you give a piece of meat that's gone bad. She realized at that moment that the golden ticket she thought she had bought was cancelled. There was no inheritance. There was no warehouse. There was no prestige. There was only a crying man who was about to become a felon. "You're pathetic," Sophia spat. Her voice was pure ice. "You lied to me. You said you were a partner. You said you controlled the assets. You're nothing but a cheap thief." Brad looked up at her, his face streaked with tears and snot. "Soph, please. We can fix this." She let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "There is no we. I'm not marrying an embezzler. I'm not marrying a man who has to beg his daddy for mercy on his knees. My mother was right. You're trash." She turned her back. She didn't even look at me. She just walked away, stepping over the train of her wedding dress, heading for the exit, without looking back once. The room was silent except for Brad's ragged breathing. The remaining guests were frozen, witnessing the total disintegration of a family. It was a tragedy, but it was a necessary tragedy. The rot had to be excised, and then cutting through the silence came the sound I had been waiting for. Sirens. At first it was a distant wail rising and falling in the night air. Then it got louder, closer, more insistent. Blue and red lights began to flash against the tall windows of the ballroom, casting chaotic shadows across the floor. The cavalry had arrived. The double doors at the back of the room swung open. But it wasn't a waiter. It wasn't a guest. It was Ben Sterling, my attorney. He looked grim, his face tight and hard. He carried a briefcase in one hand and a stack of files in the other. Flanking him were 2 uniformed police officers and 2 men in plain clothes, who had the distinct no-nonsense look of financial crimes. Detectives. Ben walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He didn't look left or right. He walked straight to the stage. He walked straight to me. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked down at Brad, who was still on his knees with his head bowed in defeat. Ben sighed, a sound of deep regret. But he didn't hesitate. He looked up at me and nodded. "It's done," Thomas Ben said quietly. The judge signed the warrant. The bank confirmed the forgery. I nodded back. "Thank you, Ben." The metallic click of handcuffs tightening around my son's wrists was a sound that seemed to suck whatever air was left out of the room. It was a cold, mechanical finality that cut through the sobs and the whispers of the few staff members who had stayed to witness the collapse of the Harrington Empire. I watched from my spot on the stage, my hands clasped behind my back, feeling a weight in my chest that was heavier than any steel beam I had ever lifted. This was the moment I had engineered, the moment justice arrived. But it didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ash. Captain Miller, a man I had known for years, a man who respected the law as much as I respected an architectural blueprint, stepped forward to formalize the nightmare. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the 2 men who were now property of the state. He pulled a small laminated card from his pocket, though I knew he had recited the words 1,000 times. Richard Harrington Miller, said, his voice flat and professional. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Richard did not remain silent. He was babbling, a torrent of desperate, nonsensical denials spilling from his lips like water from a busted pipe. He looked at the officers, then at me, then at the empty tables where his prestigious guests had been sitting just minutes before. "This is a mistake," Richard gasped, sweat dripping from his nose onto his ruined tuxedo shirt. "I am a respected member of this community. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. You can't do this to me. I demand to speak to my lawyer." "You can call your lawyer from the precinct," Miller said, gesturing to his partner. The second officer grabbed Richard by the arm. The man who had strutted across this stage an hour ago, claiming to own the world, stumbled. His legs gave out this time not from a fake heart attack, but from the crushing reality that his charade was over. They had to practically drag him away, his expensive shoes scuffing against the polished floor he had trespassed on. Then Miller turned to Brad. My son was still on his knees, his head hanging low, tears dripping onto the hardwood floor. He looked so young in that moment, stripped of his arrogance, stripped of his title, stripped of the fake confidence he had stolen from my bank account. Bradley Vance Miller continued, "You are under arrest for embezzlement, forgery of financial documents, and identity theft." Brad didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just let out a low, keen sound, a sound of pure misery. He offered his hands behind his back obediently, as if he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. The moment the imposter was finally unmasked. "Dad," Brad whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Dad, please." I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I spoke now, I would break. And I needed to be stone. I needed to be the foundation that remains when the house falls down. But the destruction wasn't over yet. There was one more pillar left to crumble. Sophia Harrington had been standing near the edge of the dance floor watching the arrest with wide, unblinking eyes. She looked like a statue of a bride frozen in time. She watched her father get dragged away. She watched her fiancé get read his rights, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. I could see the frantic calculations she was making. She looked at the empty room. She looked at the foreclosure notice still frozen on the giant screen behind me. She looked at the invoice I had written, and then she looked at Brad. She didn't see a man she loved. She didn't see a life partner. She saw a failed investment. She saw a liability. She saw a man who had promised her a life of luxury and comfort, and who was now offering her a future of prison visits and bankruptcy hearings. She walked toward him. Her movements were stiff, robotic. Her white dress rustled softly, a ghostly sound in the silent room. Brad looked up at her. Hope flared in his eyes. A desperate, pathetic hope. He thought she was coming to comfort him. He thought that in this darkest moment the woman he had stolen $2 million for would stand by his side. Soph Brad choked out, "I'm so sorry. I can fix this. I promise." Sophia stopped a few feet away from him. She looked down at him with a stare that could have frozen the sun. "Fix it," she repeated, her voice shaking not with sadness, but with a rage so intense it was almost impressive. "How are you going to fix it, Brad, from prison?" "It's a mistake," Brad pleaded. "My dad. He'll drop the charges. He loves me." Sophia laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound that held absolutely no humor. "He hates you, Brad. He hates you because you're a thief. And I hate you because you're a liar." She reached for her left hand and grabbed the diamond engagement ring. The ring Brad had bought with a credit card that I had paid off 3 times. She yanked it off her finger. "You told me you were a partner," she screamed, her composure shattering completely. "You told me you ran the company. You told me you had millions in real estate. You sat there at dinner and let my parents brag about your money when you knew you were nothing but a glorified secretary stealing from his daddy." "Sophia, please," Brad sobbed. "I did it for us." "For us," she shrieked. "There is no us. I am a Harrington. We might be broke, but we are not felons. I am not going to be a convict's wife. I am not waiting for you." She pulled her arm back and threw the ring. It hit Brad square in the forehead, a hard, metallic impact that left a red mark instantly. The diamond bounced off his face and skittered across the floor, spinning and glittering under the lights until it came to a stop near my feet. "You're a fraud," Sophia spat. You're a loser. And you're poor. That's the worst part, Brad. You're poor. She turned around her veil, catching the air. She didn't look at her mother, who was crying silently at a table. She didn't look at her father, who was being hauled out the side door. She just walked away. She marched toward the main exit, her heels clicking in a staccato rhythm of abandonment. She was cutting her losses. She was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, and she didn't care who drowned as long as she stayed dry. Brad watched her go. His body slumped. The last ounce of fight left him. He was alone. Truly, completely alone. The officers pulled him up. He stumbled, his legs numb. They started marching him toward the exit, following the path Sophia had just taken. They had to pass the stage. They had to pass me. I stepped down from the platform. I walked until I was standing right in the path they had to take. Captain Miller raised a hand, signaling the officers to stop. He gave me a moment. He knew this was the goodbye. Brad looked at me. His eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a pain that was hard to witness. "Dad," he whispered. "Why? Why are you doing this? I'm your son." I looked at him. I looked at the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. I looked at the tuxedo I had paid for. I looked at the son I had loved so much that it had blinded me to his flaws for 30 years. "I didn't do this, Brad," I said softly. "You did this. You signed the papers. You stole the money. You chose them over me." "But prison, Dad," he cried. "Prison." I took a step closer to him. I was close enough to smell the expensive cologne he was wearing and the scent of fear cutting right through it. "I can buy this building, Brad," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart was breaking inside my chest. "I can buy the land. I can buy the steel and the glass. I can buy the judges and the senators. I can buy anything in this world that has a price." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But I can't buy you character," I said. "I can't buy you integrity. I can't buy you a spine. I tried. God knows I tried. I gave you everything. I gave you the easy road. And it made you weak. It made you a thief." I leaned in, looking deep into his eyes. "You have to learn that in a cell, son. You have to learn the value of $1 and the value of a last name in a place where you can't borrow either. You have to build yourself from the ground up, because the house I built for you, you burned to the ground." Brad stared at me. For the first time tonight, I saw something other than fear in his eyes. I saw understanding. It was a terrible, crushing understanding, but it was real. He realized the safety net was gone. He was falling, and he was going to hit the concrete. "I love you, Brad," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's why I'm letting you fall." I nodded to Captain Miller. "Take him." Miller gave his officers a subtle nod. They grabbed Brad by the arms and started moving him forward. Brad didn't scream anymore. He didn't beg. He just walked with his head down, shuffling toward the flashing blue lights, waiting outside. I watched him go. I watched my only son being led away in handcuffs from his own rehearsal dinner. I watched until the double doors swung shut behind him, cutting off the view. I was alone in the ballroom. The silence returned heavier than before. I looked around the room. It was a graveyard of extravagance. The tables were still set with fine china and crystal. The flowers were still blooming in their centerpieces, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded around them. Half-eaten plates of food were getting cold under the lights. The champagne was going flat in the glasses. It was a waste, a colossal, expensive, beautiful waste. I saw the diamond ring lying on the floor near the stage. I walked over and picked it up. It was heavy. It was cold. It represented a promise that had been broken before it was even made. I put the ring in my pocket. I would return it to the jeweler on Monday. I would demand a refund. Because, unlike the Harringtons, I paid my debts and I collected what was mine. Carter appeared from the shadows of the wings. He walked up to me, his face somber. "The police have cleared the building, Mr. Vance," Carter said quietly. "The guests are gone. The staff is waiting for instructions." I looked at the room one last time. I looked at the banner hanging over the head table that read Times, Brad and Sophia forever. "Take it down, Carter," I said. "Take it all down. Clear the tables. Donate the food to the downtown shelter. Send the flowers to the hospital. "And the bill?" Sir Carter asked. "For the damages, for the cancellation." "Send it to me," I said. "I'll pay it. I always pay." I turned around and walked toward the exit. I felt old. I felt tired. My feet ached in my expensive shoes. But as I walked, I felt something else too. I felt lighter. The lie was over. The charade was done. I stepped out into the cool night air. The police cruisers were gone. The parking lot was empty except for my old Ford truck parked in the owner's spot. I climbed into the cab. It smelled like dust and hard work. I started the engine. I didn't look back at Oakwood. I drove down the winding path past the security booth and out onto the open road. I was going home, to my empty house, to my quiet life. But it was an honest life, and for the first time in a long time it was mine again. The visiting room at the county detention center smelled like industrial bleach and stale fear. It was the sensory opposite of the lavender and expensive lotion at Oakwood, yet the distance between the two places was only a 20-minute drive. I sat on a steel stool bolted to the floor, my hands resting on the cold metal table waiting. I had been here before, visiting foremen who got into bar fights or subcontractors who ran shady deals, but never for my own blood. The heavy steel door on the other side of the plexiglass partition buzzed and opened with a loud clank. A guard ushered a man into the room. For a second, I didn't recognize him. The man was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. His hair, usually styled with expensive gel, was greasy and plastered to his forehead. His face was gray, covered in a week's worth of stubble, and his eyes were sunken into dark, bruised circles. It was Brad. In just 7 days, the jail had stripped away the chief operating officer and left only the scared boy underneath. He sat down slowly, wincing as the handcuffs clinked against the table. He picked up the phone receiver on the wall. I did the same. For a long minute, we just looked at each other through the scratched acrylic. I looked for the son I had raised, the boy I had taught to fish. But all I saw was a stranger who had tried to bankrupt me. "Are you happy now?" Brad asked. His voice was harsh, dry. It sounded like sandpaper scraping wood. "Is this what you wanted? To see me like this, in a cage?" I didn't flinch. I didn't offer pity. Pity was what got us here in the first place. "I didn't want you here, Brad," I said calmly. "I wanted you in your office running the logistics division. I wanted you building a life. You were the one who chose to rob the bank instead of managing it. You humiliated me." Brad flared up, a flash of his old nerve sparking in his eyes. "You destroyed my wedding. You destroyed my life in front of everyone I know. You could have handled this in private. You could have covered the loan. You have the money. You have millions. What was $2 million to you? Nothing, but you had to make a spectacle. You're cruel, Dad. You're a cruel, sadistic old man." I leaned closer to the glass. The accusation hung in the air between us. "Cruel? You think I'm cruel?" I asked. "Let me tell you what cruelty is. Cruelty is letting a man believe he's a king while he's standing on a trapdoor. Cruelty is letting you marry a woman who only wanted you for the deed to a warehouse. Cruelty would have been letting you get away with it. If I had covered that loan, Brad," I continued, my voice steady, "you would have done it again and again. You would have bled the company dry until 500 families lost their jobs. You would have ended up in federal prison for 20 years instead of county lockup." I stopped the bleeding. Did it hurt? Yes. Amputations always hurt, but they save the patient. Brad slumped back, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a crushing defeat. "It doesn't matter," he whispered. "My life is over anyway. Ben Sterling came to see me yesterday. He said the DA is pushing for grand larceny and corporate fraud. He said I'm looking at 15 years minimum." He looked at me, tears welling in his eyes. 15 years, Dad. I'll be almost 50 when I get out. I'll have nothing. That's why I'm here," I said. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I unfolded it and pressed it against the glass so he could read it. It was a plea agreement. "I spoke with the DA this morning," I said, "and I spoke with Ben. We've reached a deal, but it's entirely up to you." Brad squinted to read the paper. "What is this?" he asked. I'm going to drop the request for the maximum sentence, I explained. I'm going to reclassify the 2 million not as theft but as an unauthorized executive withdrawal provided full restitution is made immediately. If you accept the terms, the DA will reduce the fraud charges to a lesser felony. You'll serve 18 months, maybe 12, with good behavior. Brad's eyes widened. 12 months. It was a lifeline. It was a miracle. 12 months, he breathed. You do that. I'm not finished, I said dryly. There are conditions. Severe conditions. I pulled the paper away and folded it. First, full restitution. That means I'm liquidating everything you own. The downtown condo is already on the market. The Audi gets sold this afternoon. Your investment accounts, your retirement fund, your watch collection, everything goes straight back into the company accounts to fill the hole you dug. You walk out of here with the clothes on your back, and not a penny more. Brad nodded frantically. Take it. Take it all. I don't care. Second, I continued, you're fired. Obviously you are banned from the Vance construction premises. You will never hold an executive position in my company again. And you are disinherited. Brad froze. Disinherited. I'm changing my will this afternoon, I said. The trust, the future, shares the inheritance. It's all gone. You are out of the will, Brad. Until you prove to me that you can build a life with your own 2 hands, you get nothing. But Dad, Brad stammered. What am I supposed to live on? When I get out, I'll be an ex-con. I won't have a house or a car or money. Exactly, I said. You'll be exactly where I was when I started this company 40 years ago. You'll be at zero. I looked at him, and for the first time I let the mask slip. I let him see the pain in my eyes. I gave you everything, Brad. I gave you the elevator ride to the top floor, and you didn't respect the view because you didn't have to climb the stairs. Now you have to climb. But where am I supposed to go? He asked, his voice small and terrified. I hear they're hiring day laborers down at the rail yard, I said. It's hard work. Honest work. Pays minimum wage, builds character. You want me to work as a day laborer? Brad asked in disbelief. I want you to learn the value of $1, I said. I want you to understand that money represents sweat, not magic. I want you to become a man, Brad, not a director, not an heir. A man. Brad stared at the table. He was shaking. He was realizing the magnitude of the mountain he now had to climb. He wasn't just losing his freedom for a year. He was losing his identity. He was losing the soft, padded world he had always known. Why, he whispered. Why not? Just let me go. Why strip me of everything? Because I love you, I said. He looked up shocked. You think this is hate, I said. Hate would be paying your bail and letting you become Richard Harrington. Hate would be letting you live a lie until it destroyed you completely. This is love, Brad. This is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I'm taking you apart so you can put yourself back together. And this time you'll use your own bricks. I stood up. My knees popped. I felt every day of my 70 years. Ben will be here in an hour with the paperwork, I said. Sign the deal. Serve your time. Keep your head down. Read some books. Think about who you want to be when you walk out those doors. I turned to leave. Dad, Brad called out. I stopped with my hand on the heavy steel door. I didn't turn around. Will you be there? He asked. When I get out? I paused. I thought about the empty house waiting for me. I thought about the silence. That depends on who walks out, Brad, I said. If it's my son, I'll be there. If it's a thief, the door will be locked. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back, I might have turned around. I might have tried to save him again, and saving him would be the worst thing I could do. I walked out of the detention center into the blinding bright sunlight of the parking lot. I took a deep breath of fresh air. It tasted sweet, but it didn't wash away the taste of lockdown. I got into my old F-150. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I had just sentenced my own son to prison and poverty. I had just destroyed his life to save his soul. I started the engine. The radio came on, playing an old country song about hard times and redemption. It felt fitting. I put the truck in drive and headed for the exit. I had one more stop to make. One last piece of business to conclude before I could start over. I had a building to sell and a legacy to rebuild. The weeks that followed Brad's sentencing were the quietest of my life. You might think silence is peaceful, but when you live in a house built for a family that no longer exists, silence is heavy. It presses on your chest like a wet wool blanket. I spent my days dismantling the life my son had built with stolen money. It was a forensic demolition. I hired a team of liquidators to empty his penthouse. I stood in the corner of his living room watching strangers pack up his Italian leather sofas, his 70-inch TVs, and the designer suits he wore to board meetings where he did no actual work. I watched them take his watch collection. There was a Rolex Daytona he had bought the day he forged the mortgage papers. I held it in my hand for a moment. It was heavy, beautiful, and cold. It felt like handcuffs. I handed it to the auctioneer without a word. Every single item was tagged and sold. The proceeds didn't go into my pocket. They went straight back into the company accounts to fill the crater he had blasted in our finances. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle of restitution. He had to pay back every cent, even if it meant walking out into a world where he owned nothing but the name on his birth certificate. The hardest part wasn't selling the things. It was the noise outside. The story had hit the papers. Millionaire heir steals millions. Tycoon father presses charges. The tabloids ate it up. They painted me as a biblical figure, a vengeful patriarch, sacrificing his son on the altar of business. They didn't see the nights I lay awake in my study staring at the phone, fighting the urge to call the best criminal defense lawyer in the state and make it all go away. It would have been so easy. I had the money. I had the influence. I could have pulled strings, claimed it was a misunderstanding, paid off the lenders, and Brad would have walked free with a slap on the wrist. But I knew that if I did that, I would be signing his death warrant. Not his physical death, but the death of his character. If I saved him now, he would never be a man. He would be a permanent child waiting for his daddy to clean up his messes. So I sat on my hands. I let the phone ring. I let the months crawl by. About 3 months after his sentencing, I got a visitor at my office. My real office at the construction yard, not the glass tower. It was Cynthia Harrington. She arrived in a taxi because the Bentley had been repossessed the week after the wedding disaster. She looked older. The high society veneer had cracked, revealing the desperate, tired woman underneath. She didn't come to apologize. She came to negotiate. She marched into my office, blowing past the secretary, and slammed her purse on my desk. She told me I had ruined her family. She told me Richard was facing 5 years for fraud, and that Sophia was having a nervous breakdown because her social status had evaporated. She demanded a settlement. She claimed emotional distress. She claimed Brad had promised them financial security, and that as his father, I was responsible for his broken promises. I let her yell. I let her unload all the venom that had been festering in her entitled heart. When she finished panting and red-faced, I opened my desk drawer. I pulled out a single folder. It was the dossier Carter had compiled on their debts. "Cynthia," I said, my voice low and steady, "you are not a victim here. You were an accomplice. You and your husband saw my son not as a person but as a host organism. You latched onto him like leeches and sucked him dry. You encouraged him to steal. You celebrated his theft." I pushed the folder across the desk toward her. "My lawyers have drafted a civil suit naming you and Sophia as co-conspirators in the embezzlement scheme." I lied. I hadn't filed it yet, but she didn't know that. "We have the emails, Cynthia. We have the wire transfers to your shell company. If you want to talk settlements, we can talk about you joining your husband in federal prison. Or you can walk out that door, never speak my name again, and go get a job like the rest of us." Cynthia stared at the folder. She looked at me. The aggression drained out of her instantly. She grabbed her purse with shaking hands and backed out of the office. I never saw her again. It was a small victory, but it felt like cleaning a wound. I was scrubbing out the infection so the healing could finally begin. The holidays were the worst. Christmas Eve arrived with a biting cold that rattled the windows of my empty house. Usually the house would be full. Brad would be there. There would be a tree music, food, This year it was just me and a bottle of aged tequila. I sat by the fireplace watching the logs burn down to ash. I thought about Brad in his cell. I wondered if he was cold. I wondered if he had anyone to talk to. I wondered if he hated me. I got a letter from him in January. The envelope was stamped by the correctional facility. I didn't open it for 3 days. I was afraid of what might be inside. I was afraid it would be more begging, more accusations, more manipulation. When I finally gathered the courage to open it, I sat at my kitchen table, my reading glasses on my nose, bracing myself for the anger. But there was no anger. The letter was short. The handwriting was cramped and messy, written with a dull pencil. "Dear Dad," times it read. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know I broke everything. I'm working in the laundry. It's hot and smells like bleach, but it keeps my hands busy. I think about the warehouse a lot. I think about how you looked at me on that stage. You were right. I was weak. I'm trying to get stronger. Don't come visit me. I'm not ready to look you in the eye yet. I just wanted you to know that I'm paying my debt." Brad, I read that letter until the paper wore thin. It was the first time in his life he hadn't asked me for something. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged his debt. It was a small spark in the dark, but it was enough to keep me going. I went back to work with renewed ferocity. I threw myself into the business, not the boardroom part, but the dirt and concrete part. I needed to reconnect with the source of my wealth. I needed to remind myself and everyone else that Vance Construction wasn't built on fraud. It was built on sweat. I visited job sites at 5:00 a.m. I drank black coffee with the foreman. I inspected the welds. I walked the steel beams 60 stories up, feeling the wind bite my face, reminding myself that I was still alive, still capable. I was still the man who built this city. I was rebuilding my reputation, yes, but I was also preparing the ground. I didn't know if Brad would ever come back to the company. In fact, I was almost certain he shouldn't, but I wanted to make sure the company still stood for something honorable just in case he ever found his way back to himself. I wanted the name Vance to mean something again. Spring turned into summer. The days got longer. I heard rumors about Sophia Harrington. She had moved out of state, looking for a new mark, a new wallet to squeeze. Richard pleaded guilty and went to a minimum security camp. The rats had scattered, the debris was cleared, and then the call came. It wasn't from Brad. It was from his caseworker. He was being released early for good behavior and work credits. He was getting out in August. My heart hammered against my ribs. The test was ending. The real world was waiting for him. I wanted to drive up to the gates. I wanted to pick him up. I wanted to take him home, cook him a steak, and tell him it was all over. But I stayed home. I remembered my promise. If I cushioned the landing, the fall wouldn't matter. He had to walk out of those gates alone. He had to find his own ride. He had to find his own meal. He had to navigate the world as a man with a criminal record and empty pockets. It was the final exam. I spent that day pacing my living room, checking my watch every 5 minutes. I wondered where he was. I wondered if he was hungry. I wondered if he would show up at my door. He didn't. A week passed. Then 2. I hired a private investigator, not to interfere, just to observe, to make sure he hadn't gone back to drugs or the wrong crowd. The report came back a couple of days later. Brad was living in a halfway house on the south side. He was taking the bus, and he had applied for a job as a general laborer at a construction site run by one of my competitors. He didn't use his last name to call in favors. He didn't mention me. He applied as Brad ex-con willing to work. When I read that report, I cried for the first time since the night of the rehearsal dinner. I let the tears fall. They weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. He was trying. He was actually trying. That was when I knew I could sell Oakwood. I no longer needed the reminder of his failure. I needed to focus on his future, even if I had to watch it from a distance. I needed to let him build his own skyscraper, one brick at a time. I sold the Oakwood Club 3 weeks after Brad went to jail. The ink had barely dried on his plea deal when I put the for sale sign on the front lawn. People told me I was crazy. They said it was a gold mine, a monument, a jewel in the Vance crown. They didn't understand. To me, it was no longer a jewel. It was a crime scene. Every time I walked through that lobby, I didn't see the imported marble or the gold leaf trim I had paid for. I saw my son on his knees, begging for his life. I saw Richard Harrington faking a heart attack on the carpet. I heard the echo of Sophia's heels clicking away as she abandoned the man she supposedly loved the second his wallet ran dry. The building was haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of the worst night of my life. I sold it to a Chicago hotel group for $25 million. I didn't haggle. I didn't try to squeeze every last penny out of the deal. I just wanted it gone. I wanted the deed out of my name. When I handed the keys over to the new owners, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was like exhaling after holding my breath for months, but I didn't keep the money. I didn't need another $25 million, sitting in a trust fund gathering dust and attracting vultures who only wanted to be my friends for a loan. I had seen what unearned money does to people. I had seen how it rotted Brad from the inside out, how it turned him into a thief and a liar. So I did something that would have given the old Thomas Vance, the one who counted every penny and saved his coffee receipts, a heart attack. I gave it away. I established the Vance Builders Foundation. It wasn't some fancy charity for art galleries or opera houses where the rich go to feel good about themselves. It was a safety net for the men and women who actually built this country, the bricklayers with broken backs, who could no longer work, the electricians with arthritis who couldn't grip a wire stripper, the roofers who fell on hard times after a bad fall. I created scholarships for trade schools to teach young men that working with your hands is a point of pride. I paid the medical bills of retired foremen who were drowning in invoices. I built affordable housing for veterans. I used the money that had destroyed my family to rebuild the lives of strangers. And for the first time in years, I slept soundly. It's been a year since then. The calendar reads October 14th, the anniversary of the rehearsal dinner, the anniversary of the end of my old life. I'm not in an office. I'm not in a boardroom wearing a suit. I'm standing ankle-deep in mud wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat that has seen better days. I'm supervising the construction of a new community center on the east side of the city. It's a small job compared to the skyscrapers and stadiums I used to build, but it feels more important. I like the smell of fresh concrete. I like the sound of saws cutting through wood. I like the feel of the blueprints in my hands, gritty with dust. This is where I belong. Not in a tuxedo, but in work clothes. It's noon. The lunch whistle blows, cutting through the noise of the site. The machinery powers down, replaced by the chatter of the crew opening their lunchboxes and finding a place to sit. I lean against the hood of my Ford truck, unwrapping a ham sandwich and unscrewing the cap of my thermos. The coffee is hot and black, just the way I like it. I look across the street. There's another construction site over there, a luxury condo building going up. It's a massive, chaotic, noisy project. I watch the day laborers file out of the gate, looking for a patch of shade to eat their lunch. And then I see him. He's sitting on a stack of drywall pallets. He's wearing a neon yellow safety vest that is stained with grease and dirt. His boots are scuffed and gray with cement dust. His face is deeply tanned with lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes and mouth. He's lost weight. That soft, puffy corporate executive look is gone, replaced by the lean, hard muscle of a man who hauls lumber for 10 hours a day. It's Brad. He got out 2 months ago. He served 10 months of his 12-month sentence. Got out early for good behavior. He didn't call me when he was released. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a job at my company. He just disappeared into the city. I heard through the grapevine that he was working as a day laborer, taking shifts wherever he could find them, hauling buckets, mixing mortar, sweeping floors, doing the jobs he used to look down on from his glass office. Doing the jobs I started out doing 50 years ago. I watch him unwrap his lunch. It's not a prime rib dinner on a white tablecloth. It's a convenience store sandwich wrapped in crinkled foil. He takes a bite, chewing slowly, his eyes glued to the dirt. He looks tired. He looks beaten, but he also looks real. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. He takes a long drink from a plastic water bottle, and then he looks up. He sees me. The distance between us is barely 50 yards across a busy street, but it feels like a canyon. We lock eyes. I stop chewing. I wait for him to look away. I wait for him to glare at me with hatred. I wait for him to yell something to blame me for his downfall, to scream at me about the inheritance I took away and the prison sentence I handed him. But he doesn't. He holds my gaze. He doesn't smile. There is no joy in his expression, but there is no hate either. There is only recognition. He looks at my boots. He looks at my truck. He looks at the hard hat in my hand. He sees that I am working too. And then Brad nods. It's a small, dry movement. A single nod of the head. It's the kind of greeting one working man gives another at the end of a long, back-breaking shift. It's a nod that says, I see you. It says I understand. It says I'm tired, my back hurts, my hands are bleeding, but I earned this sandwich. I paid for it with my own sweat. He turns back to his food, taking another bite of his cheap lunch. He doesn't look at me again. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. My chest feels tight, but it's a good kind of tightness. It's the feeling of a wound finally starting to close. That nod, that simple, silent gesture. It was worth more than the $2 million he stole. It was worth more than the $500,000 check I tore up. It was the first honest thing my son has done in 10 years. He's learning. He's at the bottom of the mountain, and it's a long, hard climb up. He might never reach the top again. He might never be a CEO. He might never be rich. But he is a man now. He's paying his own way. He's sweating for his bread. I saved him. I destroyed his life to save him, and it worked. I amputated the limb to save the body. I finish my coffee. I screw the cap back onto the thermos. The whistle blows again. Back to work. I put my hard hat on. I look across the street one last time, but Brad is already gone, heading back into the skeleton of the building, heading back to the grind. I grab my clipboard from the truck. I look down at my own hands. They are old. They have scars. But they are clean. I did my job. I built a legacy and then I rebuilt it. It wasn't the way I wanted to do it. It wasn't the dream I had when I held him in the hospital nursery 33 years ago. But life doesn't follow blueprints. Sometimes you have to improvise. Sometimes you have to tear it all down to the foundation to get it right. I'm Thomas Vance. I'm 71 years old, and I'm still building. If you enjoyed this story of tough love and justice, please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And I want to ask you a question. Do you think I was too hard on Brad? Should I have forgiven him and let him keep the money? Or was jail the only way he was ever going to learn his lesson? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I read each and every one of them. And if you want to hear more stories about standing your ground and defending what's yours, make sure you're subscribed. Until next time, keep your hands busy and your conscience clear. This story stands as ironclad proof that spoiling a child with material wealth doesn't forge character. It only breeds weak parasites. I learned the hard way that sometimes the greatest act of love a father can perform is not lifting his son up but letting him fall face first into the cold, hard mud of reality. Money can buy skyscrapers, but it can't buy guts or integrity. The most valuable legacy we leave behind isn't a $1 million check, but the lesson of the value of sweat and a pair of honest, calloused hands. To save my son, I had to become the villain. What do you think about the sentence I handed down to Brad? Was it too cruel to send him to prison and strip him of his inheritance? Or was it the necessary salvation he needed? Leave your thoughts down below. I read absolutely every comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe to join me for more dramatic stories where justice is served cold.